welcome to my walk. Thanks for tuning in and joining me this evening. It's a really gorgeous night. I guess you can't actually really see much of anything, but here we are. And I want to pick up where I left off in the last video, which, if you haven't watched it, in essence, having just taught all day yesterday, I found myself really noticing, being deeply inspired by what it takes to genuinely learn, to be educated. And essentially, as a teacher, how strangely humbling that is. Deeply humbling and mysterious. And so I started thinking about this sense of what my understanding of teaching is, right? Versus what I initially thought it was. So we were playing with the sense in which that learning and teaching, that learning, one, is not the end result of teaching. It's not a result. It's not the end product that is delivered via the performance of the teacher. Right? And we started to look at that maybe a much more primordial sense of the word, the lived experience of to be genuinely, when education happens, when learning deeply and profoundly happens, that it's more that the teacher, if anything, comports to the presence of learning. And in that sense, has a kind of a gelassenheit, right? A letting learn. So a teacher lets learn by cultivating and dwelling with the students, in the classroom, and the environment, and the cadence and the pacing of a conversation, to asking questions, to all of the particular things that one does when one teaches. What is that, right? What is actually happening? Well, we're going to say that it's a dwelling. It's a dwelling within learning itself. It's all a letting learn. So looking at learning as, in some sense, a kind of presence, or a way in which learning is present. So getting out of the way is what teaching is, essentially, right? And it really is, I mean, in my experience, right, teaching is it's so much more subtle and surprising and deeper than it ever was. And I have the feeling of doing less and less. Definitely, I effort less and less in the willful sense of the word, right? So, for example, if I'm feeling at all frustrated, I'm probably in the old sense of teaching, right? I'm willing, performing, and something's getting in the way of my performance, and thus I'm frustrated, right? There's a wanting, a grasping, something like that, right? A kind of will, some kind. And anymore, it's more like to let learn is to, it's more like noticing when learning, where learning is, and abiding by and with it, and in being an invitation through deeply learning myself as a teacher. In fact, in some sense, I would imagine the teacher's got to be the deepest, the one who's learning the most. And perhaps that's the mentoring part of it, right? The is more of a Cartesian way of saying it, a modeling it, right? A demonstration, being that which is doing the teaching. So in some sense, there's a quality of when a moment of deep, profound learning happens, it really feels more like grace. Than that's the experience of it than it does having overcome something or hit a grand slam or something like that, right? It's a kind of listening, a hearkening to learning itself, right? And such that it, in that sense of the word, it's so interesting because it makes the content of what you teach, in some sense it makes it, in some sense it makes the content less and less significant. Yet, and in some sense, the content is simply the place that holds attention, such that that which is doing the teaching, right, can happen somehow in the background or underneath our feet in such a way that, in ways that the students don't know and the teacher doesn't know, but learning holds sway in that, as we're, laboring over some text or having some experience or going through some lecture or whatever the form it takes, right? Whatever it is that we're focusing on, that there's like an invisible hand in some sense, right? There's like the negative space. There's the no-thingness, or the context, right? That situates and gathers that moment. And what we often don't know at that time, and oftentimes if it's revealed, right, it probably isn't revealed until much, perhaps later, after the fact, that one had deeply learned. Because while we're doing whatever it is that we're doing, we don't notice that this fundamental attunement to learning itself is what we, as teacher, student, in the act of education, in the act of learning, we are conforming to something. We start to conform to learning. This conforming relationship, right, that happens, like the way that you don't notice until it's already happened, that the dawn, right, has begun. You look over at the horizon and you realize that you hadn't realized that it's getting light out and that the sun is coming up, right? And it's something similar to that, right? This way in which that the teaching, the teacher, i.e. the learning, the presence of the learning itself, is necessarily hidden. And it seems in some important way that it remains hidden, right? That it only does what it does by virtue of being withdrawn, by virtue of being concealed. And, when it comes to learning the deepest things about life, right? To really learn them is to, in some sense, allow them to come to presence, yet allowing that which is undefinable to come to presence, while restoring its keeping within the undefinable itself. That sense of disclosure part of what's essential about that is that it remain concealed. So the aletheia, the opening up of unconcealedness, right, is the very way that learning is